In the annals of history, few monarchs have etched their names in blood as deeply as Henry VIII of England. The man who had become synonymous with tyranny did not seize power through conquest or revolution. He inherited it, a seemingly blessed inheritance. However, the choices he made, the paths he forged, transformed him from a promising Renaissance prince into a figure of chilling infamy, a monster whose very name evokes both fascination and dread. When Henry Tudor ascended the throne in 1509, England was gingerly emerging from the long shadow of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had fractured the kingdom, and the Tudor dynasty, precariously perched, desperately sought legitimacy. Henry's father, Henry VII, a shrewd strategist, had secured the crown through victory and political maneuvering. The young prince, however, seemed destined for a different, perhaps grander stage. Tall, athletic, possessing a sharp intellect, he embodied the very ideal of a Renaissance king. The England of 1509 yearned for stability and the rekindling of its national glory. The medieval era was receding, giving way to the flourishing Renaissance. European courts were becoming vibrant centers of learning, artistic expression, and intricate political gamesmanship. Henry recognized that to be a truly great king, he needed to project formidable power, both domestically and on the international stage. What he tragically failed to grasp, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the devastating price his relentless ambition would exact from those around him. From the dawn of his reign, Henry displayed an insatiable obsession with forging a lasting legacy. He was not content to be merely another English monarch. He craved to be remembered as a titan, powerful beyond measure, utterly unstoppable. This burning ambition fueled every critical decision of his life, from his complex marital entanglements to his radical religious reforms and the countless executions that stained his ascent to perceived greatness. The young king's court became a dazzling showcase of Tudor power, a magnet for nobles, celebrated scholars, and renowned artists from across the continent. Yet lurking beneath this veneer of Renaissance splendor lay a disquieting undercurrent, a growing paranoia, an unchecked ruthlessness that would ultimately consume all those within his orbit. Henry's undeniable charm and keen intelligence served to mask a cold, calculating mind that viewed individuals as mere instruments to be utilized and discarded when they no longer served his ambitions. As we delve into the life of Henry VIII, we uncover a narrative that transcends the mere account of royal excess and marital discord. It is a harrowing study of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, transforming a promising young ruler into a tyrant whose reign of terror spanned nearly 4 decades. The man who began as England's golden prince would end as a bloated, diseased, and paranoid monster, increasingly isolated and ultimately abandoned by the very empire he had constructed upon the bones of his victims. What renders Henry's story so profoundly unsettling is the meticulous and almost clinical manner in which he systematically destroyed lives, all while maintaining a carefully crafted facade of righteous kingship. Each execution, each act of betrayal, each calculated cruelty was meticulously justified in his own mind as being essential for the greater good of England. By the conclusion of his reign, thousands had perished to satiate his insatiable ego, and the very fabric of the kingdom had been irrevocably altered by his obsessions. The insidious path to absolute power began with Henry's desperate yearning for a legitimate male heir. In the tumultuous 16th century, kingdoms rose and fell based upon the perceived strength of their royal bloodlines. Henry understood with chilling clarity that without a son, the nascent Tudor dynasty could easily crumble, swept away by rival claimants. This all-consuming need drove him to marry 6 times, but more significantly, it provided him with a perverse justification for the destruction of anyone who dared stand in his way. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, embodied everything a queen should be: pious, intelligent, and politically astute. She had been previously married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, a union intended to solidify the alliance between England and Spain. For nearly 2 decades, Catherine faithfully served as Henry's queen, but she committed one unforgivable sin in his eyes. She failed to produce a surviving male heir. The king's mounting obsession with securing a divorce from Catherine was not merely a matter of personal desire, it was fundamentally political. By the 1520s, Henry had become utterly convinced that God himself was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, despite the papal dispensation that had initially sanctioned the marriage. This perceived divine displeasure, he believed, explained the tragic pattern of Catherine's pregnancies, ending in miscarriages or the deaths of infants, with the notable exception of their daughter, Mary. When Pope Clement VII, caught in the complex web of European politics, refused to grant the annulment, Henry faced a momentous choice that would irrevocably define his reign: submit to the authority of the papacy or sever ties with Rome altogether. For a man consumed by the pursuit of absolute power, there was never any real question. The English Reformation was not born of deep-seated theological conviction. It was, in essence, born of Henry's unyielding refusal to accept any authority that dared to supersede his own. The momentous break with Rome in 1534 marked the definitive turning point in Henry's transformation from king into tyrant. By brazenly declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England, he had effectively positioned himself as God's representative on earth within his own realm. This was not merely a strategic political maneuver, it was the ultimate expression of his burgeoning megalomania. Now, he could not only enact laws and wage wars, but he could also dictate the spiritual fate of his subjects. Sir Thomas More, the brilliant humanist and esteemed Lord Chancellor who had loyally served Henry, understood with chilling clarity the dangerous path the king was now embarking upon. More's principled refusal to acknowledge Henry's supremacy over the church was not simply about adhering to religious doctrine, it was about recognizing the inherent danger of allowing any mortal man to wield such unchecked and absolute power. His subsequent execution in 1535 marked a grim milestone, the first time Henry had killed someone whose only crime was refusing to validate his insatiable ego. The execution of Thomas More reverberated throughout Europe, sending shockwaves of disbelief and horror. Here was a man universally respected for his profound learning and unwavering integrity, put to death simply because he refused to kneel before Henry's self-proclaimed spiritual authority. More's death was not merely an act of murder, it was a blatant declaration that Henry's will had now become the supreme law in England, superseding even the dictates of conscience and the tenets of faith. With Catherine of Aragon cast aside and the Church of England firmly under his control, Henry was now free to pursue his obsessive infatuation with Anne Boleyn. The woman who had so captivated the king was, in many ways, the antithesis of Catherine, young, vivacious, and possessing the perceived potential for fertility. Henry's passionate courtship of Anne had already stretched for several years, and his desperation to possess her had driven him to tear apart the very religious fabric of his kingdom. Anne Boleyn, a woman of sharp intellect and political acumen, understood the perilous game she was playing. She had witnessed firsthand Henry's ruthless treatment of Catherine and recognized that royal favor could swiftly transform into royal fury. Yet, she also understood that her influence over the king granted her unprecedented power. For a time, she skillfully wielded that power, strategically placing her supporters in key positions and subtly advancing the Protestant cause in England. The wedding of Henry and Anne in 1533 was conducted in clandestine secrecy, as the king's marriage to Catherine had not yet been officially annulled. This clandestine ceremony spoke volumes about Henry's character. He was willing to commit bigamy to obtain what he desired, then use his absolute royal authority to retroactively legitimize his actions. The law was not a constraint that bound him. It was a malleable tool that he shaped to conform to his own desires. When Anne gave birth to Elizabeth in September 1533, Henry's disappointment was palpable and poorly concealed. Another daughter represented another crushing failure in his unrelenting quest for a male heir. The king who had moved heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn now began to view her as just another obstacle to his dynastic ambitions. The woman who had once been the object of his greatest obsession was rapidly becoming his greatest disappointment. Anne's subsequent miscarriages only served to deepen Henry's growing resentment. By 1536, he had fully convinced himself that his second marriage was as cursed as his first. The same paranoid thinking that had driven him to sever ties with Rome now turned against the woman who had once been the very center of his world. Anne Boleyn, who had risen to such dizzying heights, was about to experience a fall more precipitous than anyone could have possibly imagined. The charges leveled against Anne Boleyn in 1536 were so preposterous and outrageous that they revealed the true depths of Henry's paranoia and almost pathological cruelty. Accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, Anne faced allegations that were almost certainly fabricated. The king, who had once penned passionate love letters to her, now orchestrated her downfall with the same methodical ruthlessness he had demonstrated toward Thomas More. The trial of Anne Boleyn was a blatant mockery of justice, with the outcome predetermined by Henry's unwavering will. The evidence presented was flimsy and circumstantial, the witnesses were compromised, and the proceedings were conducted with unseemly haste. Yet, the very fact that a Queen of England could be tried for treason and adultery sent a clear and chilling message throughout the kingdom. No one, regardless of rank or previous favor, was safe from the king's unpredictable wrath. Anne's execution on May 19, 1536, marked a new level of brutality in Henry's reign. The woman who had been his queen for barely 3 years was beheaded by a skilled French swordsman, a supposed mercy granted to her as it was considered quicker and more humane than the traditional axe. As Anne knelt in the Tower of London, preparing to meet her death, Henry was already actively planning his next marriage, scheduled to take place the very next day. The almost indecent speed with which Henry transitioned from Anne's execution to his marriage to Jane Seymour revealed the chilling coldness that lay at the very heart of his character. There was no period of mourning, no moment of reflection on the tragic events that had just transpired. For Henry, Anne's death was simply a necessary, if unpleasant, step in his continuing quest for a male heir. Her life had been reduced to nothing more than a failed experiment. Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, embodied everything the king believed he desired in a queen. Unlike the strong-willed Catherine and the politically astute Anne, Jane was submissive, quiet, and seemingly malleable. She had observed the fates of her predecessors and understood that survival in Henry's increasingly tyrannical court required absolute compliance with his every whim. Her personal motto, "Bound to obey and serve," perfectly encapsulated her approach to marriage with the increasingly unpredictable king. The birth of Edward VI in October 1537 finally provided Henry with the legitimate male heir he had so desperately sought. The joy that swept through the court was palpable and almost overwhelming. After nearly 3 decades of marriage and multiple wives, the future of the Tudor dynasty seemed secure. Yet even this long-awaited triumph was tainted by tragedy, as Jane Seymour died just 12 days after giving birth, likely from complications related to the delivery. Jane's death appeared to affect Henry more profoundly than the executions of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, perhaps because she had ultimately given him what he craved most. For once, the king seemed to experience genuine grief rather than merely frustrated anger. Yet even this sorrow was filtered through his relentless obsession with legacy. Jane had died a hero in his eyes because she had fulfilled her primary purpose as a royal wife. The years that followed Jane's death witnessed Henry's paranoia reaching new and terrifying heights. The king, who had once been supremely confident in his power, now perceived threats lurking everywhere. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive uprising in northern England, had shaken his confidence in the loyalty of his subjects. His response was characteristically brutal. Hundreds of rebels were executed, and Henry made it abundantly clear that any challenge to his authority would be met with overwhelming and merciless force. Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant administrator who had skillfully orchestrated Henry's break with Rome, became the next victim of the king's growing instability. Cromwell had arranged Henry's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, and the king's deep embarrassment over this political miscalculation demanded a scapegoat. The man who had served Henry faithfully for over a decade was executed in 1540, his severed head displayed on London Bridge as a stark warning to others. The execution of Thomas Cromwell marked a significant turning point in Henry's reign. No longer was he content to eliminate only those who openly opposed him. Now he was willing to destroy even his most capable and loyal servants when they failed to meet his impossible and ever-shifting standards. The message was clear. Proximity to power was not a shield against the king's wrath. It was, in effect, an invitation to destruction. By the 1540s, Henry had fully become the monster that his earlier actions had merely foreshadowed. The handsome, athletic prince who had ascended to the throne in 1509 was now a bloated, diseased tyrant who ruled through a potent combination of fear and intimidation. His court had degenerated into a place where even the slightest misstep could result in swift and brutal death. and his subjects lived in constant terror of attracting his unwanted attention. The pattern of Henry's marriages had become grimly predictable: infatuation, marriage, disappointment, and ultimate destruction. Anne of Cleves was fortunate to escape with her life, accepting an annulment in a generous settlement rather than facing the full force of the king's wrath. But Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, would not be so fortunate. Her youth and beauty had initially attracted Henry's attention, but her alleged infidelities, whether real or imagined, would ultimately seal her tragic fate. Catherine Howard's execution in 1542 demonstrated with chilling clarity that Henry had learned absolutely nothing from his previous acts of murder. Once again, a young woman paid the ultimate price for the king's obsessions and paranoia. The charges against Catherine were based largely on her sexual history before her marriage and alleged relationships during her brief tenure as queen. The evidence presented was questionable at best. The trial was rushed, and the outcome was, tragically, inevitable. The speed and sheer brutality of Catherine Howard's downfall shocked even Henry's hardened and cynical courtiers. She was barely 20 years old when she was beheaded, and her perceived crime was largely one of youthful indiscretion and inexperience rather than malicious intent. Yet Henry displayed no trace of mercy, no recognition of his own role in placing a teenager in such an impossible and precarious position. Her death was simply another casualty in his ongoing war against anyone who failed to live up to his impossible expectations. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, understood the deadly game she was entering when she agreed to marry the king in 1543. She had witnessed 5 previous queens navigate the treacherous waters of marriage to Henry VIII, and she was determined to survive where others had tragically failed. Her survival strategy was simple, yet effective: complete and unquestioning submission and a careful avoidance of any topic that might potentially trigger the king's simmering paranoia. The later years of Henry's reign were characterized by increasing physical and mental deterioration. The once athletic and vibrant young king had become a grotesque figure, suffering from what historians now believe was a complex combination of diabetes, kidney disease, and possibly syphilis. His leg ulcers had become so severely infected that their foul odor could be detected from rooms away, and his mood swings had become even more unpredictable and violently erratic. As Henry's physical health declined precipitously, his paranoia reached its absolute peak. The king, who had once been surrounded by loyal friends and ardent admirers, now trusted no one completely. Even Catherine Parr, his most diplomatic and cautious wife, found herself under investigation for heresy in 1546. Only her quick thinking, her unwavering loyalty, and her complete submission ultimately saved her from becoming the third of Henry's wives to face the executioner's block. The final years of Henry's life revealed the full horror of what he had become. The court that had once been the envy of all of Europe had devolved into a place of hushed whispers and constant fear. Nobles who had once eagerly competed for the king's attention now prayed to avoid it, knowing that royal favor could transform into royal fury without any warning. The very foundations of English society had been warped and twisted by one man's unchecked power and his insatiable ego. By 1546, Henry's physical condition had become truly grotesque. Contemporary accounts paint a disturbing picture of a man so swollen with disease that he had to be lifted by complex mechanical devices. His once handsome face had become bloated and pockmarked. His body emitted a constant and overpowering stench from his infected wounds, and his temper had become so volatile and unpredictable that even his most trusted servants approached him with visible terror. The king's eating habits had become as monstrous and unrestrained as his personality. Unable to engage in any physical exercise due to his debilitating condition, Henry consumed massive quantities of food and drink, further exacerbating his already severe health problems. His dining table had become a grotesque scene of royal gluttony, with the king gorging himself on rich and elaborate feasts while his subjects struggled with poverty and the devastating aftermath of his religious reforms. Henry's increasingly strained relationship with his own children during his final years reflected his twisted and often contradictory priorities. He had spent decades obsessing over securing the male succession, yet he barely knew his only son Edward, who was largely being raised by tutors and servants. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were alternately legitimized and bastardized based solely on their father's shifting whims and his immediate political needs. The psychological toll of Henry's reign extended far beyond his immediate victims. An entire generation of English nobility had grown up in constant fear of their unpredictable king, never knowing when a careless word or a perceived slight might result in their swift and brutal demise. The very fabric of English society had been rewoven around the ever-present thread of royal terror, creating a pervasive culture of suspicion and paranoia that would outlast Henry himself. Foreign ambassadors who visited Henry's court in his final years left behind chilling accounts that read more like descriptions of a madman's kingdom. The king, who had once been a major player in European politics, had become an object of both fear and revulsion. His former allies now treated England as a rogue state, ruled by a tyrant, whose complete unpredictability made him dangerous to both friend and foe alike. The legacy of Henry's complex and often brutal marriages had created a succession crisis that would plague England for decades to come. His desperate quest for a male heir had resulted in a convoluted web of legitimacy questions, religious divisions, and fiercely competing claims to the throne. The very dynasty he had fought so hard to secure had ultimately been weakened by his own actions. As 1547 dawned, it became increasingly clear that Henry VIII was dying. The man who had terrorized England for nearly 4 decades was finally succumbing to the various diseases that had been slowly consuming his body for years. Yet, even in his final illness, he remained a potent force of danger, issuing death warrants and ordering executions from his sickbed. The monster he had become would not be tamed, even by the imminence of his own death. Henry's final days were spent within the imposing walls of Windsor Castle, surrounded by the trappings of power that had meant everything to him. Yet those who attended him during his last weeks described a pathetic figure, a man whose body had betrayed him as completely as he had betrayed so many others. The stench emanating from his infected leg ulcers was so overwhelming that few could bear to remain in the same room. The king's deteriorating mental state during his final illness revealed the full extent of his paranoia and self-deception. He continued to believe, despite all evidence to the contrary, that he had been a good king, that his actions had been justified by necessity, and that history would ultimately remember him as a figure of greatness rather than a monstrous tyrant. The man who had caused so much widespread suffering seemed utterly incapable of recognizing the sheer horror he had inflicted upon his kingdom. Even his deathbed was marred by characteristic cruelty. Henry's final act as king was to sign the death warrant for Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, who was executed just days before the king's own death. This senseless and utterly pointless murder, committed by a dying man against someone who posed no real threat, perfectly encapsulated the gratuitous brutality that had defined Henry's entire reign. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII finally breathed his last, his body completely consumed by the various diseases that had been eating away at him for years. The man who had ruled through fear and intimidation spent his final moments in agonizing pain, his flesh rotting even as he desperately clung to life. It was, in many ways, a fitting end for someone who had caused so much suffering, a death that was as unpleasant and degrading as the countless deaths he had inflicted upon others. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death revealed the true and precarious state of the kingdom he was leaving behind. England was financially ruined, deeply religiously divided, and politically unstable. The strong and centralized monarchy that Henry had believed he was building had actually been significantly weakened by his own excesses and his almost pathological cruelties. His son, Edward, was only 9 years old, hardly old enough to provide the strong and decisive leadership that the kingdom so desperately needed. The reaction to Henry's death throughout Europe was telling and revealing. While diplomatic protocol dictated formal expressions of condolence, many foreign rulers privately celebrated the passing of a man they had come to view as a dangerous madman. The king, who had once been courted by emperors and popes, had died isolated and reviled, his international reputation in complete ruins. The disposal of Henry's body presented its own unique challenges. The king had become so bloated and diseased that special arrangements had to be made for his funeral procession. Legend claims that his corpse was so swollen with putrefaction that it actually burst open during the journey to Windsor, where he was to be buried, a grotesque end to a grotesque life. The legacy of Henry VIII extends far beyond the immediate damage he caused during his lifetime. His actions fundamentally altered the course of English history, creating religious and political divisions that would persist for centuries. The English Reformation, born not from genuine religious conviction, but rather from his insatiable ego, would lead to decades of religious conflict and persecution. The psychological impact of Henry's reign on English culture cannot be overstated. An entire generation had grown up believing that absolute power was normal, that the king's will was law, and that any resistance to royal authority was ultimately futile. This pervasive acceptance of tyranny would make it far easier for future monarchs to abuse their power, secure in the knowledge that their subjects had been conditioned to accept even the most outrageous royal behavior. Perhaps most tragically and ironically, Henry's obsessive quest for a male heir ultimately proved to be utterly pointless. His son, Edward VI, died young and childless, leaving the throne to his daughters, the very people Henry had spent so much time and effort trying to bypass. The male heir he had murdered and tortured to obtain ruled for only 6 short years, while his daughter Elizabeth would go on to become one of England's greatest and most celebrated monarchs. The story of Henry VIII serves as a chilling and cautionary reminder of what happens when power is exercised without any restraint or accountability. The young prince who had seemed destined for greatness was transformed into a monster whose very name still evokes horror more than 4 centuries after his death. His reign demonstrates that absolute power doesn't simply corrupt, it ultimately destroys, leaving behind a legacy of devastation that can last for generations. In the end, Henry VIII achieved everything he thought he wanted: absolute power, complete religious authority, and undeniable historical significance. Yet the legacy he created was one of terror rather than greatness, of destruction rather than lasting construction. The king who had been so obsessed with being remembered as a figure of unparalleled greatness would indeed be remembered, but primarily as one of history's most compelling cautionary tales about the inherent dangers of unchecked power and an unlimited ego. So, as we've seen, the life of Henry VIII is a stark and unforgettable lesson about the seductive and ultimately destructive nature of unchecked power. He began with so much promise, but his insatiable ego and relentless pursuit of control transformed him into a figure whose reign is synonymous with tyranny and heartbreak. It's a powerful reminder that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in exercising restraint and seeking justice. What are your thoughts on Henry VIII? Did anything in particular surprise you about his story? I'd love to hear your interpretations and insights in the comments below. Feel free to ask any questions you have, or just share your perspective on this complex and troubling figure. And if you found this exploration of Henry VIII's life insightful, please subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss out on future deep dives into fascinating historical figures and pivotal moments in history. Thanks for watching.